Today I thought it might be helpful just to rattle off some tips and tricks that, at least in my opinion, are good for investing in carbon offsets. So part of the reason that I'm doing this is I recently went to Greenfin, and there were some interesting conversations up there about what carbon investment risk really should look like and how portfolios should be put together. So the first big question that I want to kind of deal with is, should carbon portfolios be broad or narrow? And I think traditionally, a lot of people coming into this field are thinking, well, a broad portfolio is always lower risk, right? And in some sense, they're right. There's certainly lower natural risk. The idea that, you're buying something like 15 different carbon projects and they're all going to catch fire and burn down, no, they're not going to do that. There might even be less carbon risk. So if you're buying something like 15 different carbon projects, given the current ratio of things today, maybe only half of them will have structural problems with them. I think that there are arguments to be made that a broad portfolio is lower risk. But on the flip side of things, we also have to consider the benefits of a narrow portfolio. For one thing, if a narrow portfolio allows you to do more diligence on the projects that you're looking at, maybe you are actually reducing risk. I just talked about how, at least half of carbon projects out there today have some dubious numbers attached to them. Well, if you're just picking them willy-nilly and throwing them into a portfolio, you're going to end up with a ratio that's about the same as the market ratio. But if you're spending a lot of time and only picking 3 projects instead of 15, then you can probably pick the good ones. I think we also have to point out that, carbon offsetting, unfortunately, it's mostly about PR. And a narrow portfolio offers a lot less risk in terms of PR. Because if you have a broad portfolio, odds are fairly good that someone's going to write something terrible about a project in your portfolio. Maybe old Elias is going to say something horrible about one of the projects. That's going to filter down to a reporter. That reporter is going to type up a report that says, oh, and Delta and Shell and your company bought these carbon credits, and therefore, all of your good work has been impugned. I mean, these articles, there's not enough nuance in them to say that, oh, and they bought 14 other projects that were actually pretty good, and the majority of their portfolio is still okay. No, you're just going to get caught out and put into the firing squad. So I actually do think that there is probably less risk in a narrow portfolio. And I often advocate people to do a little bit of extra due diligence and research and pick a handful of really good projects. Now, that brings me to the next topic that I want to talk about, which is partnerships. Partnerships are very risky in this space, and you have to pick your partners very carefully. A lot of people are doing insetting these days, and they're partnering with project developers who can develop carbon projects just for them. Well, that's great, but the reason that 50 to 70% of carbon credits today are not very good is that a large portion of the project developers in this space were manipulating the numbers. And here I want to dwell on a very interesting little point that we've come across at Renoster, which is that almost universally, larger project developers create worse projects. We've run the numbers on the top project developers and then some of the smallest ones as well. Almost universally, all of the large project developers have systematic biases in their projects. Maybe they're over-rigging their numbers. They've got a shop set up of remote sensing scientists who are really good at tuning the carbon numbers to get the most credits out of these projects. Maybe they're not getting, the co-benefits are not being, are not filtering down to the people on the ground. And so again and again and again, what we see at Renoster is that little tiny partners, little tiny project developers who only have 1 or 2 projects, they are doing things absolutely right because they're the ones who don't have the huge margins. The sad fact is, if you're doing things right, there are very narrow margins in the carbon development space, and so odds are you're not going to be able to expand exponentially into like a $1 billion project developer. And so what's happened over the last 10 years is that those groups that have expanded into a $1 billion project developer, they're not doing things right. And I think that this speaks to a larger point, which is that if you're not in the carbon space, but you maybe attend the meetings and stuff, like I just came back from Greenfin, the people that you're meeting in these meetings, maybe they're not the most representative of high quality projects. Because you have to think, who's going to have the money to send somebody to Greenfin in Boston? It's going to be the billion-dollar project developer. They're going to have the money to set up their tables and hit everybody up with salespeople and wine and dine you after the talk about all the great work they're doing. But it's not going to be the tiny little Indonesian project developer who's only got one project. They're sure as hell not coming to Greenfin. And so, really think through who you're meeting at these meetings, whether or not they've been a part of the problem in the past. Because, it's worth doing a lot of due diligence on these people and looking at their track records, especially if they've been around for a long time. I went to a talk at Greenfin from the Forest Investor Club, and it's exactly what it sounds like. I mean, these are folks who are looking to invest in forest conservation. And this is fantastic. I think that everyone at the Forest Investor Club, their heart is really in the right place. But then I looked at some of their partnerships. And I was shocked to find some of the worst players are their partners. And in fact, it was very ironic because I went down the list and, they had some partners who genuinely are malevolent. We've reviewed dozens of their projects here at Renoster. We find every single one of them has some level of manipulation in them, and most of the time they're taking the natural resources from people and providing very little in return. And then I go to the next one on the list, and it's this tiny little project developer that's doing fantastic. And this really speaks to what I'm talking about with finding the right partners. Because we really need to make sure that when we're making partners for the future, that we're kind of watching out to make sure that we're not partnering with the exact same people who got us into this mess in the first place. The next point that I want to make is that people spend a lot of time trying to suss out project quality by looking at carbon protocols, looking at the age of carbon projects, and looking at where carbon projects are taking place on Earth. And all three of these indicators, they are very loosely correlated with quality. And I think people have often leaned too heavily into these three indicators as a crutch for actually seeing whether or not the carbon credits that they're buying are good. So let me first talk about where carbon projects are taking place. There is not a strong correlation between quality and location. That's just a sad fact. In the United States, you're much less likely to have illicit deforestation inside your projects, but you're more likely to have gerrymandering. In Brazil, you're much more likely to have deforestation, but much less likely to have, gerrymandering. There are very few places in which we can really point to and say, don't do business here. Because, we see carbon projects that are really good and really bad right next to each other, and it's got a lot more to do with the project developer and how they're going about this and their governance structure and where the money is going than it does just the geography. Let's talk about age. People often conflate newer carbon credits with being higher quality, and that is just not the case. The sad fact is, Verra protocols, they've barely changed, and carbon quality has improved over the last 5 years, that's for sure, but it's not where it needs to be. We see brand new Verra projects coming online that are, would arguably just score 0 on Renoster's criteria. So here's one called Big Trees in Canada. These guys don't share where their location is. This is a fundamental aspect that everybody internationally agrees upon is important for carbon projects. This project refuses to tell people where they're actually conserving their trees. Here's another brand new carbon project. I think it's first started in 2021, Night Tapayo. It's already canceled. It failed to stop deforestation, and it didn't go through the proper consent process with people on the ground. The fact is, newer projects, that is not in and of itself a guard against low-quality carbon credits. And it's actually a little bit of an inverse situation, because if you can identify old projects that are really good, you know that those projects have been good for the last 10 years, and they're probably going to continue to be good. So I often point to a project called Manoa, which is taking place on the edges of the Amazon. It's done a fantastic job of being very conservative in their numbers and stopping deforestation dead in its tracks. This is a project that's more than 10 years old, and you can be absolutely certain that on year 11 or year 13, they're going to continue to stop deforestation dead in their tracks. The thing about Red Plus projects is you don't really know if they're going to be successful until they've had a couple of years to work things out. It takes a little bit of time to actually start stopping deforestation, and it takes a little bit of time to actually start paying people on the ground to stop deforestation. And so there is kind of a sweet spot of kind of old projects that are good that I often recommend for people. The other thing that I mentioned was that carbon protocols. Yes, there are carbon protocols that are better than others. I don't know of any REDD Plus protocols that are fantastic. So if you're looking for REDD Plus projects, I wouldn't go and be picky about certain REDD Plus protocols because all of them have the ability to be manipulated pretty strongly. And again, it really depends on the project developer. Some projects under really bad protocols are fantastic and vice versa. So, it's a very soft indicator, but the actual correlation between quality and protocol, it's very loose. So all of this adds up to say, do more diligence than just looking at age, location, and protocol. Really talk to the project developer, make sure that the money is going to where it belongs, make sure that deforestation has actually been curbed, and make sure that the baseline that they're saying would have happened in these areas is realistic. I wanted to kind of maybe finish this talk by talking about the Delta lawsuit a little bit. In case you're unaware, Delta is being sued by, I don't know, a bunch of hip green people for basically buying carbon offsets that they say were fraudulent and then saying that they were carbon neutral when they really weren't. How do I feel about this? Well, personally, I am deeply conflicted. On the one hand, Renoster has reviewed a bunch of Delta's projects, and many of them are really bad. Bad enough that Delta should have known. I mean, we're talking about bottom of the barrel, very low prices, not very effective projects. I've talked to lawyers about this case. They seem to think that there really isn't a case there, but it's mostly PR. And I also read the case brief, and I was a little disappointed not to see specifics in there about projects that Delta had supported here. On the one hand, I do feel that there is some level of buyer beware. You are making an investment in this, and then you're making very strong claims about this. You have to do some level of diligence. People have known for about 5 years now, or at least they should have known for about 5 years now, that carbon credits had sometimes really dicey qualities. Myself and others have been screaming from the rooftops that this has been the case since at least 2019. And Delta's just been plowing ahead with their cheap offsets. So I do feel that Delta has some responsibility there. But at the same time, what I see is horrible. Because what I've seen from multiple large companies is that they're just done with carbon offsets. They're just walking away from the space. And I've asked them, okay, what's your solution then to dealing with your pollution? Nothing. They have nothing. They're going to work on, 5 years from now, maybe reducing their carbon footprint internal. No. They're not going to do a damn thing. So what I really see is maybe the best solution that humanity had for dealing with its emissions being ruined. And this is very upsetting to me. And to some extent, I blame the Delta lawsuit. But to a much larger extent, I blame the people in the carbon industry who made this possible. And so what I'm really upset about is that I don't think Delta should have been sued. They shoulder a fifth of the responsibility here. The people who really should have been sued are the people who sold Delta fraudulent credits. And mainly we are talking about Vera and some of the larger project developers here. Because they knew going in that, what they were doing was pretty manipulative. It was pretty obvious, and people were telling them this for a long time now. West's first paper came out in 2020. And they kept doing it. And so these are the people that I'm really upset with. I'm really upset that the whole notion of carbon offsetting could be destroyed and humanity could lose its best tool for dealing with climate change because, these folks at the top, mostly at Vera and some of the top project developers, kind of created this fiasco. And so I wish that the lawsuit were leveled at them. I don't know how to feel about the Delta lawsuit. I think it's done some damage to the carbon community. Whether or not that's deserved, we'll see. We're getting into a very interesting space in the carbon offsetting business. We'll see what ends up happening in the industry. So, best of luck out there, and reach out to me if you have questions about how to put together a low risk carbon portfolio.